welcome to this deep dive. It's one you all requested, and we're excited to jump in.
Yeah, it should be a good one.
We're going to be looking at the work of John Stuart Mill.
A giant in the field. Really a fascinating thinker.
He was, and we've got excerpts from a ton of his work, like A System of Logic, Principles of Political Economy, On Liberty, and even his autobiography.
You really get a sense of the scope of his intellect when you look at the range of topics he covered. I mean, from logic and economics all the way to women's rights and political theory.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to dive into all of it, but especially, what's going to make us think differently. That's what I'm always looking for.
Absolutely. The goal here is to extract the most thought-provoking elements of his work, the things that are still relevant to us today.
Exactly. And actually, maybe we should just jump right in with his autobiography.
Yeah.
Because it's wild, right? I mean, learning Greek at 3 years old.
Right. Talk about an intense upbringing. His father, James Mill, was a leading intellectual of his time. And, he designed this incredibly rigorous education for John Stuart. It's not something I'd recommend for everyone, but it definitely shaped his thinking.
For sure.
I mean, he was reading and writing by the age of 4.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. And by 8, he was already translating Latin texts.
Wow.
It wasn't all just rote memorization, though. I mean, James Mill really instilled in John Stuart this deep appreciation for logic and reason.
I see. So it was like a foundation for his entire intellectual journey.
Exactly. You can see how that early training influenced everything he did later on.
Like in A System of Logic, for example.
Exactly. That's a great example. I mean, he argues that even deductive reasoning, the kind that seems purely abstract, well, it ultimately stems from our experiences and observations of the world.
So even logic has to have some connection to reality.
In a way, yes. He challenges the idea that we can arrive at truth solely through these, thought experiments, detached from the real world.
So even with something as abstract as logic, he's grounding it in experience. That's pretty cool.
It is. And this kind of thinking carries over into his economic theories, too.
Right, his Principles of Political Economy.
Yeah, that one, I'll be honest, it's not exactly a light read.
Definitely not a beach read.
But it contains some seriously relevant insights, even for today. Like, for instance, he goes deep into the relationship between production, population growth, and technological improvements.
Really?
Yeah, and he recognized that there are limits to growth, especially when you factor in things like natural resources.
So he was already thinking about sustainability back in the 19th century.
In a way, yeah. He argued that as an economy reaches what he called a stationary state, the focus should shift from maximizing production to improving the quality of life. Making sure resources are distributed fairly. Yeah, and it really makes you think about our current debates, right? Like economic growth, income inequality, all that stuff.
Definitely. It shows how far ahead of his time he was.
For sure.
So let's move on to maybe his most famous work, On Liberty. Everyone knows Mill as the champion of individual freedom. But did he really believe in, absolute freedom?
That's a great question. And the answer is not quite. I mean, he was a huge advocate for individual liberty, for sure. But he also recognized that there are limits, especially when it comes to preventing harm to others.
Okay, I see.
And this is where his famous harm principle comes in. The idea is that individual actions can only be restricted if they pose a real threat to others.
Makes sense. So freedom, but with responsibility.
Exactly. You got it.
Now,
But the tricky part, of course, is defining harm. Right?
Where do we draw the line?
Exactly. What constitutes harm? Who gets to decide that? These are questions that we're still grappling with today.
And Mill provides, a framework for thinking it through.
Right. Exactly. And his work is still relevant, even in the age of the internet and social media.
It makes you wonder how he would have viewed things like online hate speech, the whole debate around free speech versus harmful content.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question to consider. I mean, he was super aware of the dangers of censorship. He argued that even wrong or offensive opinions have value.
In what way?
Well, because they can force us to re-examine our own beliefs. And based on that, he would probably be pretty cautious about restricting speech too much, even online.
It seems like applying his thinking today requires, a really careful consideration of the potential harms and benefits of any kind of restriction on liberty.
Totally. And that careful consideration is what Mill was all about.
We need to really weigh the evidence, engage in debate, and consider the consequences.
Exactly.
And those are all things that Mill would have been on board with.
100%.
So how about his ideas on representative government? Do they also connect to this idea of balancing individual rights with the needs of society?
Absolutely. In Considerations on Representative Government, he really digs into the complexities of democracy.
Which is something people talk about a lot.
Right. But it's complicated, isn't it? And he makes this point that majority rule, while important, shouldn't come at the expense of minority rights.
That's a really important point because a lot of times people equate democracy just with majority rule.
Yeah, and they don't always stop to think about how that can impact those who hold different views.
Right.
And Mill saw that. He argued that a healthy democracy needs more than just voting.
Interesting. Like what?
Well, for example, he advocated for things like proportional representation systems.
Yeah.
Systems that would give more voice to minority viewpoints and prevent what he called the tyranny of the majority.
Right.
And he was also a huge advocate for free speech. He saw as essential for a functioning democracy.
So he was really concerned about the potential for any group, even a majority, to, suppress different voices.
Absolutely. He saw that silencing opposition actually weakens society.
How so?
Well, because it limits our capacity for innovation and progress. Right?
Yeah, makes sense.
He saw the freedom to challenge conventional wisdom as essential, like for both intellectual and social growth.
So he was arguing that beyond just having the right to vote, people should actually participate, be active in the political process.
Yeah.
And that we need to protect diverse viewpoints.
Exactly. He believed that a truly representative government should reflect the full spectrum of opinions and interests within society, not just the dominant ones.
That's really fascinating.
It is, and it's still relevant today as we navigate all the complexities of our own democracy.
Absolutely. Okay, so before we jump into some of Mill's other work, is there anything else, about individual liberty or representative government that we should touch on here?
I think it's key to emphasize how interconnected these concepts are for Mill. He saw individual liberty as a foundation for a just and thriving society. He believed protecting those rights, encouraging open dialogue, and ensuring representation were all crucial pieces of a well-functioning democracy.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about. And in part 2, we'll be diving into some of his even more challenging ideas, like his work on gender equality.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one. And I think you'll find his arguments in The Subjection of Women to be just as relevant and thought-provoking today as they were back then. All right. So let's dive into The Subjection of Women. This work really highlights Mill's commitment to, shaking things up. I mean, he wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And this one was particularly radical for its time.
Yeah, absolutely. He was making a strong case for gender equality in the 19th century. I mean, that was unheard of.
Yeah.
And he didn't just point out these inequalities that women were facing. He really systematically broke down all the justifications that were used at the time to, keep women in a subordinate position.
Right, like all those arguments about women being inherently inferior.
Exactly. He argued that those ideas were not based on any real differences between men and women,
But rather,
on a long history of oppression, limited opportunities for women.
and I think one of the things that struck me most in this work was his use of the term legal slavery to describe the institution of marriage back then.
It's a powerful phrase, isn't it?
Yeah, it really highlights how much control men had over women's lives.
Yeah. He was basically saying that women were denied full personhood under the law. They were treated as dependents of their husbands.
And this wasn't just about legal rights either.
Right. Mill believed that this subjugation had, psychological and social consequences.
That makes sense.
It wasn't just hurting women, it was holding back society as a whole.
I see. So he's connecting women's equality to the progress of society.
Exactly. He made this really compelling case that we can't have true intellectual and moral progress unless men and women are interacting as equals.
And that's a point that's still relevant today. I mean, we've come a long way, but we're definitely still working towards that goal of true gender equality.
No question. And his insights into the psychological effects of this kind of oppression are really powerful.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, he recognized that by confining women to these domestic roles, it wasn't just limiting their choices, it was actually shaping their self-perceptions, their aspirations.
Right. So it created this kind of cycle of disempowerment.
Yeah, exactly. And he argued that that's harmful to both individuals and to society as a whole.
And this is something that I think a lot of us can relate to, right? Even if we haven't experienced that kind of overt oppression, we all have these, societal expectations that can box us in.
It's true. And Mill was challenging us to examine those expectations, those assumptions about gender roles, to really think about the implications they have on our lives.
That's a great point. So we've talked about Mill's ideas on logic, liberty, representative government, and his really powerful arguments for gender equality. Now I think it's time to shift gears and talk about another core idea in his work, utilitarianism.
Yeah, utilitarianism, it's a concept that often gets, oversimplified.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, people tend to think of it as just seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Like, that's all there is to it.
Right, like hedonism.
Yeah, kind of. But Mill's version is much more nuanced than that. He recognized that not all pleasures are created equal.
Okay, so there are different kinds of pleasure.
Right. He distinguished between higher and lower pleasures.
Like, what's an example?
Well, he argued that pleasures derive from things like intellectual pursuits, artistic appreciation, and moral actions, those are inherently more valuable than just simple physical gratification.
So it's not just about maximizing pleasure in a purely hedonistic sense.
Exactly. A society full of people indulging in just fleeting pleasures, that wouldn't necessarily be a good society, according to Mill.
So what would a good society look like?
Well, he believed that it would be a society that fosters, the development of our higher faculties, one that promotes a sense of shared purpose and well-being. It's not just about individual happiness. It's about creating a society where everyone can flourish.
So it's about, like, reaching our full potential.
Exactly. And this actually ties back to his thinking about the role of government.
Right, because it's not just about protecting individual rights. It's about creating the conditions for people to live fulfilling lives.
Exactly. And this is where his emphasis on education comes in.
Because a well-educated citizenry is the foundation of a strong society.
Precisely. He saw education as essential, not just for economic advancement, but for cultivating, citizens who are capable of critical thinking, moral reasoning, and engagement in public life.
So he's weaving together all these different ideas like individual liberty, gender equality, utilitarianism, and the role of government. It's pretty amazing how it all fits together.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive how he creates this coherent vision for a better world.
And it wasn't just about theories for him. He was passionate about putting these ideas into practice.
Right. Absolutely. He saw philosophy as a tool, something we can use to understand the world and make it a better place.
So let's talk a little bit about his views on knowledge itself. He had some pretty strong opinions on how we come to know things.
He did. Mill was a strong empiricist, meaning he believed that all knowledge ultimately comes from our experiences.
So not from, like, innate ideas.
Right. He rejected the idea that we're born with certain knowledge or that we can arrive at truth just through, pure reason alone.
So you had to be pretty skeptical of anyone claiming to have absolute knowledge, without any basis in experience.
Totally. He believed that our understanding of the world is always evolving. We gather new information and we have to test our beliefs against reality.
So it's a constant process of learning and refining our understanding.
Exactly. And he saw the scientific method as the most reliable way to do that.
Makes sense. But what about things we can't observe directly, like abstract concepts or moral principles? How did he account for those?
That's a great question. He argued that even those abstract concepts, they ultimately come from our experiences.
So how does that work?
Well, he believed we form these ideas by generalizing from specific things we've observed. For example, our concept of justice.
Okay, yeah.
That might be based on our own personal experiences of fairness and unfairness.
So even though we can't, see justice directly, our understanding of it comes from those real-life situations.
Precisely. And Mill believed that even our most complex ideas, they have their roots in the world around us. This empirical approach was central to his thinking.
So he's basically encouraging us to be skeptical of those, big pronouncements that aren't backed up by evidence, and to always be willing to rethink our beliefs.
Exactly, to be open to new information, to new perspectives. He saw that as key for both individual growth and societal progress.
So his emphasis on empiricism, it kind of connects back to his ideas about individual liberty, right? And the importance of debate and open discussion.
Yeah, totally. Because a society that embraces free inquiry, that's open to challenging the status quo, that's a society that's more likely to make progress.
And to correct its mistakes along the way.
For sure. Because Mill recognized that knowledge is never static. It's a process, one of continuous discovery and refinement.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, from Mill's unique upbringing to his work on logic, liberty, gender equality, utilitarianism, and even the nature of knowledge itself. It's clear that his influence goes way beyond just, academic philosophy.
It really does. His ideas still shape how we think about ourselves, our society and the world. He challenged us to be critical thinkers, to fight for what's right and to strive for a better world.
Absolutely. So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, let's consider what Mill's legacy really is. What can we learn from him today as we face the challenges of the 21st century?
I think one of the most valuable lessons is this idea of continuous learning. Mill reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge, the fight for a better world, these are ongoing processes.
So we've really dug deep into John Stuart Mill's world, haven't we? I mean, from his really unusual upbringing to his ideas about logic, liberty, and equality, and even his thoughts on knowledge itself. And I think what's clear is that his influence goes way beyond just philosophy textbooks.
It really does. I mean, you can see his fingerprints all over how we think about society today. Our political systems, our ideas about individual rights and social justice. It's all connected to his work in a way.
Right. And what strikes me is how, his ideas are so interconnected. It's not like he was compartmentalizing. Like here's my theory of logic and over here's my theory of liberty. He really saw it all as part of a bigger picture.
Yeah, exactly. Like individual liberty wasn't just some abstract ideal for him. It was the foundation for creating a society where everyone could flourish.
And where progress was possible,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. And he saw true progress as requiring both a commitment to individual rights, A&D, a deep concern for the well-being of the community as a whole. You can't have one without the other.
That's such a key point. And I think it's something we often lose sight of today. Like we get so caught up in our own individual rights that we forget about the responsibility we have to each other.
Yeah, and he was writing in a very different time, of course. But I think his work provides a framework for navigating these complex issues even today.
Absolutely. Especially in the age of social media where it's so easy to fall into these echo chambers where you're only exposed to people who think exactly like you do.
And that's something Mill would have been really concerned about, I think.
How so?
Well, because he was such a strong advocate for the free exchange of ideas, even the ones you disagree with.
And that can be really hard sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you're confronted with views that you find, offensive or even harmful.
Right. But Mill saw it as essential. I mean, he believed that a society that silences dissenting voices, even those it considers dangerous, is ultimately harming itself.
And limiting its potential for growth.
Exactly. Because it's in those moments of disagreement, when we're forced to confront different perspectives, that we have the opportunity to really learn and grow, both as individuals and as a society.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like that saying, the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Right. And Mill was all about that process of seeking out the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. He recognized that knowledge is a journey. It's not a destination. And that a healthy society is one that's constantly questioning, challenging dogma, adapting to new information.
Which ties back to his emphasis on empiricism, right?
Okay.
Like grounding our beliefs in evidence.
Exactly. And that approach is so important, especially today when there's so much misinformation out there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, everyone's got an opinion, right? And it's all over the internet.
And it can be hard to sift through all of that noise, to figure out what's true and what's not.
So how do we apply Mill's thinking to this modern problem? I mean, he couldn't have predicted social media.
Right. But I think his principles still hold up. Being skeptical of those grand pronouncements that aren't backed up by evidence, being willing to change your mind when presented with new information, and, engaging in respectful dialogue, even with people you disagree with.
And this brings us back to his work on gender equality.
Yeah.
I mean, he was challenging the status quo in a really profound way.
He was. And I think his work on the subjugation of women is just as relevant today as it was back then. It's a reminder that we need to be constantly challenging those entrenched power structures and social norms, fighting for the rights of all individuals, regardless of gender, race, or any other arbitrary category.
And that fight is never really over, is it?
No, it's definitely not. But Mill provides us with a roadmap, a set of principles to guide us. He reminds us that progress requires more than just good intentions. It takes real effort, critical thinking, and a willingness to speak out against injustice.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered so much ground, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed this exploration of John Stuart Mill's incredible body of work.
Me too. He really was a brilliant thinker.
And his ideas continue to be relevant today as we grapple with the complexities of the 21st century. So as we sign off, I want to leave everyone with this final thought. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a world that embodies the principles of liberty, justice, and equality for all.
Well said.